Yoga has become, without a doubt, a phenomenon in the Western world. Everyone and their aunt is practicing it in some way, often simply as a form of physical exercise, but at other times with more spiritual undertones. But with this omnipresence of yoga and yoga studios in America and Europe, there also appear certain debates regarding it and its place. Many will point out that it is actually a tradition with origins in Indic religions like Hinduism, actually making up a central aspect of the religious practice of that religious ecosystem. This becomes a relevant and interesting question when we consider that even places like churches sometimes hold yoga classes, and the religious roots or aspects of yoga thus become a quite pressing and important question. But the history of yoga undoubtedly begins in India. It is within the vibrant religious and philosophical environment of ancient India that we see the first developments of this tradition. But there's no single point, person, or text that we can point to and say this is where it definitively begins. It's actually a lot more complex than that, and quote-unquote yoga and the different ways that it was understood developed and evolved over time, as we said earlier. In fact, there are plenty of ancient texts and sources that do mention yoga, the word yoga, from the Upanishads to the Bhagavad Gita and others, but in these texts, yoga can mean many different things, and it certainly did not have the fixed connotations that it has today, and especially not in the West. The word yoga itself is a Sanskrit term, but is one that can have many different meanings. It comes from the root yuj and is cognate with the modern English word to yoke, thus to tie something to something else, to unite things in some way. But it can also mean very different things. It can mean an arrow, right? So the Sanskrit language is very... We get mentions of the word yoga as early as in the Upanishads, and here its meaning isn't all that clear, but seems to refer to some kind of state, some state of mind or a goal. For example, very famously it is mentioned in the Katha Upanishad, which says, quote, "When the five perceptions are stilled together with the mind, and not even reason bestirs itself, they call it the highest state. When senses are firmly reined in, that is yoga, so people think. From distractions a man is then free, for yoga is the coming into being as well as the ceasing to be." Here, yoga seems to be a kind of state that is achieved when one reins in the senses and the mind, when we go beyond the workings of the intellect and the senses and reach some kind of stillness. But at this point, and these later Upanishads are believed to have been composed sometime around 500 BCE, the word yoga didn't necessarily denote a certain bodily practice as such, but it's referred to as either a state of mind that is to be reached, or as some kind of wider technique in order to reach this higher state. Both this yoga as a goal and yoga as a practice show up in the early sources. But that isn't to say that yoga-like practices, in terms of bodily techniques, didn't exist at this point, even though they weren't called by that name yet. Indeed, at around the same time that the Upanishads were appearing, there were significant things happening in the religious landscape of India. The Vedic cult of the Brahmins had been the dominant form of religion, centered on the cultic rituals of offering to fire, and which is expressed in the early Vedic scriptures. But especially in northeastern India and in the middle of the first millennium BCE, there appeared new forms of spiritual practice, something often called the Śramaṇa movement. This was a movement that was quite different from the Vedic cult, and indeed often involved outright critiques of the latter. It consisted of ascetics, often living in the forest, practicing meditation and other practices with the goal of becoming liberated, what's known as moksha, from the cycle of death and rebirth, the cycle of samsara. The focus here wasn't on the external cult and its rituals, but on a kind of internal practice, a transformation of the self and the mind as the path to enlightenment and liberation. Some of these Śramaṇa ascetics outright seem to have rejected much of the Vedic religion and critiqued it. This includes significant figures like Mahavira and Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha. and their movements eventually grew into major religions of their own, namely Jainism and Buddhism, respectively. But other strands of this Śramaṇa movement appear to have instead integrated or reinterpreted the Vedic teachings, often by internalizing the outer ritual into internal processes and practices. And it seems that it is this development that produced a lot of the Upanishads, including the Katha Upanishad that I quoted earlier. But significantly, it is in this wider Śramaṇa movement and their practices that we seem to find some of the earliest examples of techniques and approaches that we would perhaps recognize as yoga-like. Importantly, these practices at this time aren't confined to either what we today call Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism or any such fixed tradition. In this early melting pot that produced all of these later religions, the earliest precursors to yoga seem to have developed through mutual influence and interaction. And this involved importantly what is known as tapas, austerities, different techniques of controlling and using certain energies of the body. The word tapas literally means something like heat, and these practices were aimed at utilizing the heat or energy that is created in the body when we do certain things, including when we have sex or we sit in very uncomfortable positions. This tapas energy, it was believed, could have transformative effects on the person, and these ancient munis, or sages, used different mental and indeed bodily techniques to achieve them, including meditation, chanting mantras, breath control, as well as, indeed, certain bodily postures, both seated and standing. In the word of W.O. Kelber, quotes, "Crucially, man may develop or generate such magical heat within himself through the performance of various self-imposed austerities such as fasting or chastity. In that such austerities generate heat within man, they too are regarded as a form of tapas. Tapas refers therefore not only to heated power, but also to the heated effort which produces it. The accumulated tapas of asceticism saturates the devotee, making him a reservoir of heated potency. This power may manifest itself as a sexual and fecunding energy, which when released generates rainfall, fertile fields, and biological offspring. Through an asceticism that overcomes nature, man is able to control nature. The goals and sought-after effects of these practices could vary from getting rewards from the gods, to get spiritual powers, siddhis, to achieve immortality, and to reach liberation, moksha. So this, one could certainly argue, forms some of the earliest examples of what would at least later be known as yoga. But yoga as a phrase was still used in a variety of different ways at this point, which becomes very clear in one of the most famous texts of the entire Hindu tradition, the Bhagavad Gita. Written probably somewhere between 300 BCE to 400 CE, this work, which actually is just a chapter in the much larger work called the Mahabharata, recounts the very dramatic conversation between the warrior Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna, who, over the course of the conversation, turns out to be God himself. Krishna counsels Arjuna on the self, the Atman, on detachment and the nature of reality in order to help him cope with the difficult situation of having to kill and fight enemies, family members and teachers in the opposing army. It's a masterwork of religious and philosophical literature, and yoga plays a central role in it, although not necessarily in the way that we might expect based on modern presumptions. The texts seem to use the term yoga as almost synonymous with a path or a discipline in some way, as an approach to life and to spirituality. In fact, Krishna talks about a number of different yogas in the text. There is karma yoga, the yoga of action, or of deeds and practices. There is Jnana yoga or Jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge. There is Dhyana yoga, the yoga of meditation. And lastly, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of loving devotion to God. And it seems, although some might disagree, that Krishna lays down a clear hierarchy of these different yogas or paths, with Bhakti Yoga or devotion being the highest and most exalted of them all. But even within this same text, the yoga is seemingly used in different ways. For example, in chapter 11, which contains the very famous part where Krishna shows his true cosmic form to Arjuna in a positively psychedelic mystical vision, the god incarnate then says, "But you will not be able to see me with your own eye. I give you a divine eye. Behold my lordly yoga." Having spoken, O king, Shri Krishna, the great lord of yoga, then revealed to Arjuna the supreme lordly form. And even in other places, it seems to use yoga in that more practical way mentioned before too. Quote, yoga is skill in action. So we have a situation in late antiquity where there are certainly early versions of the practices and some of the ideas that we call yoga, and the word yoga and yogin was being used to refer to certain states, techniques, disciplines, and practitioners. But it isn't really until a while later that we start to see yoga emerge as a school of philosophy and practice. And it does so with another very significant text, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. This is a text that seemed to take the many ideas about yoga, ascetic practice, as well as Sankhya philosophy and others, and synthesize them into a concise text that came to be the standard work for the yoga school, establishing some of its core philosophical ideas. The author of this work, Patanjali, is a pretty elusive historical figure. As with many of these ancient sages, there has been some significant disagreement regarding when he actually lived, and thus by extension when the Yoga Sutras were composed or gathered. Many scholars today argue that Patanjali probably lived in the 4th or 5th century CE or AD, and the text can thus be dated somewhere within that span of time, although others do place them a few centuries earlier too. In any case, the Yoga Sutras became very important in establishing yoga as a prominent school of thought in ancient India. We sometimes talk about these 6 darshanas, or 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy, which included Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Vedanta, and Mimamsa. Now keep in mind that many criticize this outline today, partly because it was a much later categorization often projected backwards, but there's some truth to the idea that there were these strands of thought and practice, even though the borders between them aren't very clear or firm at all really. But they do point to certain philosophical and practical movements in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. For example, the school of Vedanta, which we have explored at length on the channel previously, is largely based on the Brahma Sutras, also known as the Vedanta Sutras. The Nyaya school is based on the Nyaya Sutras, the Sankhya school is based on the Sankhya Karika by Ishvara Krishna, and Yoga is based primarily on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. That's due to having essentially the same metaphysical outlook and sharing many different features. And this becomes very apparent in the Yoga Sutras, and especially its commentary, or Bhashya, which many believe to have been written by Patanjali himself. In some ways, you could say, and many have said, including in ancient sources, that Sankhya and Yoga are 2 sides of the same coin. Sankhya makes up the metaphysical and philosophical core, whereas Yoga focuses on the practices and techniques to reach liberation within that Sankhya framework. So what is the metaphysics and basic worldview of these schools then? Well, at its core, it's a dualistic system. The Sankhya philosophy sees reality as consisting of 2 fundamentally separated principles: Purusha, which could be considered as pure consciousness and self, sometimes cognate with the Upanishadic concept of the Atman. So this is Purusha, pure awareness, pure consciousness. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand there is Prakriti, matter. Now these two are, again, fundamentally separated, so this is not a monism like Advaita or in other schools, but a deeply dualistic philosophy. Purusha is our true self, the pure consciousness or awareness that is silent, still, and at peace. But most of us are caught up in Prakriti, matter, and its various expressions. And the goal of this system is to turn away from Prakriti, to remove all matter from our mind. And so importantly, when we talk about matter or Prakriti in this case, this includes our thoughts, emotions, and what we would call aspects of our mind today. So it's not matter in the modern sense of physical objects, but everything in the world of appearance and experience-based Prakriti. That is what we are supposed to turn away from, and to instead realize our true nature as Purusha. This general outlook is true of both Sankhya and Yoga, at least as outlined in the Yoga Sutras, but it is often said that their approaches differ somewhat. The Sankhya school tries to reach this liberation of Purusha through knowledge, through Jnana or Dhyana. By studying the texts and philosophizing, so to say, we can realize reality and our true self for what it is. The yogins, on the other hand, especially with Patanjali, instead take the practical approach. It is through yoga and its meditative techniques that we can turn away from Prakriti and realize Purusha. And when we look at the Yoga Sutras themselves, this becomes very apparent. Very famously, Patanjali begins the entire work by giving us a kind of definition of yoga itself. Quote, "Yoga is the stilling of the changing states of the mind." A very famous quote indeed that sets the stage for the entire work. It could be argued that the term yoga here also refers to the process of stilling the turnings of the mind, but primarily it seems to point to that state of stillness itself. That is what yoga is. The sutras are an exploration of human psychology in a way, on top of an exposition on the path to reach the ultimate goal of life, what's known as samadhi, a kind of meditative consciousness free of the workings of the mind and the so-called tattvas. Put in another way, it's a state of independence, solitude, or detachment that Patanjali likes to call kaivalya, independence basically. The scholar and translator of the sutras, Edwin F. Bryant, says, quote, "It, the Yoga Sutra, is concerned with presenting a psychology of mind and an understanding of human consciousness rather than a metaphysics of manifest reality." In actuality, Patanjali's text reads more like a manual for the practitioner interested in plumbing the depths of human consciousness than a philosophical exposition. The text was clearly written by a Brahmin scholar and ascetic, but we can also see clear influence from Yogacara Buddhism, Jainism, and other schools of ascetic practice, as well as we said, Sankhya philosophy. In this way, as we have pointed out, Patanjali was really a systematizer and a syncretist. James Mallinson and Mark Singleton also write about the sutras that, quote, "The Patanjala Yoga Shastra," which is a term referring to the sutras and its bhashya, its commentary, sort of together, the Patanjala Yoga Shastra represents a Brahminical attempt to appropriate yoga from the Śramaṇa traditions. And in many ways, the whole purpose and message of the work is contained in the first couple of sutras, the first of which we have already become acquainted with. Now, the teachings of yoga are presented. Yoga is the stilling of the changing states of the mind. When that is accomplished, the seer abides in its true nature. Otherwise, at other times, the seer is absorbed in the changing states of the mind. So we can see from these very short aphorisms that a lot is contained in the very sort of brief sentences. There is a seer, a pure awareness or true self that stands independent of all outside phenomena, including our thoughts and feelings. Patanjali uses the word drashtu, or seer, to refer to this principle, but we can clearly see that it is equivalent to the idea of Purusha in Sankhya philosophy, or perhaps also the Atman in the Upanishads and in Vedanta. But there are also these turnings of the mind, these fluctuations of the mind, which are known as vrittis in Sanskrit. He goes on to explain that these can basically be anything that we experience: knowledge, imagination, memories, etc. In the fourth sutra, he says that the seer often mistakenly identifies with these vrittis. We have a self which we identify with, which are in relation to all these vrittis and fluctuations. Perhaps this body of ours is part of this self that we imagine ourselves as having, or even just our thoughts about ourselves, or the more fundamental sense of the I-ness that we have. This is all false, however. Instead, when the person can still all these turnings, all these fluctuations or vrittis, and return to the pure self, the seer, it abides in its own nature, which is independent of all other things. Only then has one reached the state of yoga, or kaivalya, independence. The way to do this is through yoga, in the form of meditation and one-pointed concentration on certain things, such as God, for instance. Indeed, the text is in fact quite theistic in nature and is deeply pious, again and again mentioning a kind of devotion and worshipping of God or the Lord, Ishvara, as a key part of this wider method. In some ways, Patanjali kind of seems to talk about at least two kinds of yoga in the text. On the one hand, he talks about what's known as Kriya Yoga, the yoga of action. But the methods mentioned there also kind of seem to later fall under a wider category of practice, and one that has indeed become a lot more famous. This is, of course, what is known as Ashtanga Yoga, or the 8-limbed yoga. You could see this as a kind of list of 8 steps of meditating, leading to that ultimate stage of samadhi and kaivalya. And these 8 limbs are, number 1, yamas, so abstinences such as non-violence, celibacy, and other ethical concerns. 2, niyamas, which means observances. This is more the active rituals to be performed, such as cleanliness, study of the Vedas or sacred scriptures, these tapas or ascetic austerities that we mentioned, and of course, as mentioned, contemplating God or Ishvara and worshipping this absolute reality.